Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into the transcript from a really significant public event, the Sarvadharma Prarthana Sabha, which translates to an all-faith prayer meet. It was held at Gandhi Smriti on Gandhi Jayanti and notably attended by senior political figures. The explicit aim was to embody religious harmony.
Right, and that's where the core tension seems to emerge, doesn't it? When you look at the material, there's this contrast between the stated goal, Sarvadharma, all faith, and how it was actually carried out. The devotional music part, the Bhakti Sangeet, it leaned very heavily, very specifically on classical Hindu songs and Sanskrit prayers.
Exactly. So the central question we need to unpack today is this. Did that substantial weight, that focus on specific Hindu devotional material, fundamentally undermined the stated spirit, the intended goal of an all-faith prayer meet?
My position is that, well, yes, it did. I think the sheer volume and the specific theological nature of the content created a kind of functional imbalance. And that imbalance limits the all faiths promise, regardless of what the event was called.
Okay, I see that, but I hold a different perspective. My stance is that the event actually succeeded in its spiritual and inclusion intent. And that's because the focus was really on the philosophy behind the bhakti, universal themes like dedication, virtue, and also because the program deliberately included key Gandhian elements, explicitly unifying ones that framed the whole thing. So, look, the Assembly's core purpose was honoring Mahatma Gandhi's principles, particularly his focus on devotion, on truth. And I think this was, well, beautifully achieved through the kind of bhakti that was presented. Devotional music, at its philosophical root, it's about personal virtue, dedication, the search for truth. These are concepts that inherently go beyond sectarian lines. And to make sure that frame was clear, the organizers included those universally recognized Gandhian cornerstones.
Which included the essential elements. Yes, I grant you that.
Precisely. So we see the inclusion of the hymn Vaishnav Jan Tu Tene Kahiye, which is, a foundational text describing the qualities of an ideal person, someone who helps others, who is free from greed and pride. And of course, the heart of the prayer segment was that harmonizing chant, Ragapati Raghava Raja Ram. But I think the defining proof, really the proof of intent, is the explicit inclusion of that line, Ishwar Tare Nam Sabko Bhagawana Lahu Nam, Sabko Sangathi De Bhagawan. That line, put right into the most iconic Gandhian chant, well, that serves as a totally unambiguous signal that the event's framework was religious harmony. And then finally, the commentary at the end tied everything back to Gandhi's focus on truth, humility, and self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, principles that apply universally, no matter where the music came from.
Okay, I do acknowledge the vital importance of those explicit unifying elements, I really do. But the evidence of the transcript itself, it compels me to assess the Sarvadharma concept based on, structural representation, not just the stated intention. The event's extended musical content was frankly overwhelmingly dominated by specific, often quite lengthy, narratives and theological references drawn from a single tradition. We're not just talking about generalized spirituality here. We're looking at detailed narrative bhajans, devotional songs, repeated at length.
But couldn't you argue those narratives, like the repetition of Achyutam Keshavam, Krishna Damodaram, are really allegories for something universal?
They might function as allegories, but they're allegories that require a certain familiarity with a specific Puranic cosmology to fully grasp. Think about the references to Mira or Shabri, the gopis, Yashoda. These are very specific figures within the Krishna and Rama mythologies. And furthermore, the performance wasn't just songs. It included deeply specific, formal Sanskrit recitations, classical Vedic prayers even, the invocation to Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, for instance, and specific peace mantras like Om Sahana Vavatu. These are codified, ritualistic, and textual practices. So, given this overwhelming volume of specific Hindu textual material, even with the Ishwar Allah line included, the event, I think, functionally pivoted. It shifted from an all-faith meet to essentially a Hindu devotional concert dedicated to Gandhi.
Okay, This brings us to a crucial point then. The symbolic weight of those unifying hymns versus, as you put it, the practical weight of all the specificity. My position remains that the deliberate inclusion of the Ishwar Allah line and the recital of Raghupati Raghavar Raja Ram, which, let's remember, Gandhi himself championed as a mantra for religious unity, that sets the interpretive framework for the whole event. These few powerful, deliberate elements, both political and spiritual, establish the framework of harmony, and that, I argue, is the primary overarching message the event intended to convey. The framework directs how we should interpret the content within it.
I hear your argument about the framework, I do. But I remain unconvinced that a framework consisting of just a few lines can really withstand the structural pressure of, say, 20 minutes of detailed theological content from one specific tradition. Volume matters. It matters significantly when we're assessing functional inclusivity. The unifying elements were, well, extremely brief compared to the extended devotional segments. Just think about the length of the Meera Bhajan, detailing her struggles for dedication, or the lengthy repetitions of Krishna's names in Achyutam Keshavam. This specific, detailed content dictates the overall sensory and theological flavor of the prayer experience. If the vast majority of the content requires cultural and theological literacy in Vaishnavism, knowing who Sharbri was, understanding the significance of Yashoda, then the few unifying lines at the end feel less like a binding contract and more like, well, a polite disclaimer.
Yet, don't these choices also reflect a kind of cultural rootedness in the very soil where Gandhi's movement itself was born? To remove all cultural specificity in pursuit of some completely abstract universalism, doesn't that risk stripping the event of its power, its connection to the national heritage that Gandhi himself drew strength from? Isn't there value in showcasing the depth of one tradition while explicitly dedicating that depth toward the goal of harmony?
There's certainly value in cultural display. I wouldn't deny that, but not, I think, when the event is explicitly titled All Faith. That title raises a very specific expectation, an expectation of structural parity, or at the very least, substantive inclusion from other major faith traditions present in India. The organizers could have, for example, incorporated Christian hymns on service, or perhaps excerpts from the Guru Granth Sahib on humility, maybe verses from the Quran focused on truth, weaving them structurally alongside the Hindu bhajans. The fact that they didn't, well, it suggests to me that the Sarvadharma promise was largely symbolic, perhaps limited to that two-line addendum.
Okay, let's shift our focus slightly then to the highly classical nature of those concluding Sanskrit recitations. You mentioned the invocation to Saraswati and the final peace mantra, Om Sahanavavatu. You argue these are too specific, too textual.
Exactly. These aren't simple folk songs, are they? They are formal stutis, specific Vedic texts. They require, frankly, deep cultural and often linguistic knowledge to fully engage with. An invocation to Saraswati, the Hindu goddess of learning, or that closing peace mantra, which seeks mutual protection and knowledge for teacher and student. That moves beyond generalized devotional music. It moves into highly specific liturgical practice. And this level of textual specificity inherently excludes, or at least mystifies, participants whose faith traditions don't use these particular texts. It makes the term Sarvadharma practically problematic, especially in that final segment.
I acknowledge the cultural and linguistic specificity, of course, but I would argue these need to be understood in their philosophical context within the assembly itself. Gandhi championed the pursuit of satya, truth, above all else. These classical recitations, especially the peace mantras, the invocation to Vyas, the compiler of the Puranas, they represent the highest pursuit of knowledge and auspiciousness within the Indian philosophical tradition.
But isn't that abstracting the medium of the prayer away from its specific religious identity?
That's a critical distinction you're making, absolutely. But consider this. Acknowledging the depth and the antiquity of the host country's spiritual and intellectual tradition through these classical recitations doesn't inherently negate the spirit of harmony. You could argue it shows profound respect for the ancient pursuit of truth and learning, which is a universal principle Gandhi upheld. Om Sahana Vavatu, for instance, isn't really about a specific deity. It's a profound articulation of the need for collaborative learning, for peace between teacher and student. The medium might be ancient Sanskrit, yes, but the message, peace, learning, collaboration, is profoundly universal, and it fits perfectly within Gandhi's ethical framework.
That's a compelling argument for the universal philosophical meaning, I'll grant you that. But the practical result, again, is this structural imbalance. And it really highlights how difficult it is, perhaps, to execute genuine Sarvadharma in practice. If the intent is to draw a universal moral lesson from the material, maybe we should look at how the commentary tried to bridge that specific content back to Gandhi's broader ethical principles.
Right, that brings us nicely to point 3. And the commentary, I think, did an excellent job linking the devotional content to Gandhian ethics. The speakers explicitly connected the event back to Gandhi's emphasis on truth, on humility, on self-reliance, Atmanirbharta. The Bhakti Sangeet, particularly the stories embedded within those songs, like Mira's unwavering dedication despite persecution, or Shabri's patient waiting for Rama, they stress dedication, perseverance, sacrifice through difficulty. This aligns the devotional practice directly with the moral and political framework Gandhi advocated for the nation. And that's irrespective of the song's specific religious origin. The moral lesson becomes the crucial takeaway, not necessarily the mythological vehicle used to deliver it.
I agree that the commentary attempts to draw those universal lessons, yes, but the structural issue persists for me. To truly reflect the complexity of Gandhi's own vision of interfaith respect, the execution of the event itself should model it. The event used specific Hindu myths, Shabri, feeding Rama, the gopis' relationship with Krishna, to illustrate universal virtues like dedication and humility. If the goal is truly universal, why rely solely on one tradition's mythology? Why not utilize, say, narratives of sacrifice from Sikh history, or perhaps examples of service from Christian parables to illustrate truth or humility alongside the Hindu examples?
Well, perhaps because the Bhakti tradition in India is itself inherently tied to a history of social reform and spiritual access, things which deeply influence Gandhi. So using that rich, existing cultural material provides a very specific and resonant context for the local audience, making it easier for them to grasp those universal moral lessons like Atmanirbharta. It's about leveraging existing cultural literacy, perhaps, to teach universal ethics.
But leveraging that specific cultural literacy simultaneously creates a structural barrier for non-Hindu attendees, doesn't it? It makes the experience feel fundamentally different. For one group, it's celebrating their heritage. For another, it's observing a lesson derived from what might feel like a foreign cosmology. This, for me, is the difference between true shared prayer and perhaps more of an educational demonstration. Gandhi's principles, particularly nonviolence, ahimsa, and tolerance, they seem to demand a structural commitment to interfaith respect. And this heavy reliance on specific Hindu mythology, even with the best philosophical intentions, arguably fail to meet that standard. The medium itself, when it's so heavily weighted towards one side, kind of becomes the message.
So ultimately, I stand by my position that the deliberate inclusion of those few but very powerful harmonizing lines and hymns, coupled with the event's clearly stated purpose of honoring Gandhian principles like truth and nonviolence, that successfully framed the devotion as a universal spiritual exercise. The specific musical choices, yes, they were culturally rooted, but that explicit Ishwar Allah statement acts as the binding contract of inclusion, overriding, in my view, the cultural specificity of the individual songs.
And I reaffirm my core concern that the sheer volume and the deep theological specificity of the chosen repertoire, everything from the extensive narrative bhajans to those highly specific Sanskrit stutis and Vedic chants, created an overwhelming structural imbalance. And this imbalance, I think, overshadows the explicit call for harmony. It raises some difficult, maybe uncomfortable questions about what the term Sarvadharma practically means when it's executed in a national context that really demands full, visible representation.
Indeed. The material certainly provides a rich opportunity, doesn't it, to examine the complexity. The real challenge of implementing interfaith respect within a framework that must also, simultaneously, celebrate a deep cultural and religious identity.
Absolutely. And we'd encourage the listener to consider how these specific details, That balance, or perhaps imbalance, between symbolic gestures and actual structural representation, how they reflect on the larger and certainly enduring principles of unity and inclusion that are celebrated during Gandhi Jayanti.